next?
Definitely. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. My name is Janae Jameson, Director of Programs here with the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice in Louisiana. And we're at the 501c3 Civic Engagement Table. And what that really means, of course, we engage voters to go out and vote, right? We focus primarily in turning those infrequent voters of color into frequent voters. We have an extensive election protection program, and we're centered, again, on policy and advocacy to ensure that we center the most vulnerable populations throughout the state of Louisiana. And super excited to be on this panel, and thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Janae. And also your jacket is phenomenal. Ashley, would you like to go next? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Bullion, and I'm the policy analyst at Disability Rights Louisiana. As my primary goal, I give out accessibility voting trainings to different organizations around the state, and I also do other policy work for the organization. And I'm just excited to be with you all today.
Thank you so much, Ashley. We're so excited to have you guys all here today. We know voting has been quite the hot topic for many years now. We know that people with disabilities don't have the access they necessarily need for voting all of the time. So we can just jump right into our first question, which is, what are some of the greatest barriers to voting accessibility in Louisiana? And so we can go in the order that we did introductions in. So Tori, would you like to go first?
Certainly. Thanks, Lillian. I kind of think of this question in two categories. I'm a lawyer, so often I'm starting with what the law looks like, but then how it's also executed or brought into effect. And I think one of the challenges in Louisiana is where disability access laws are in relation to voting, and the fact that sometimes they're just confusing or overly burdensome, or they don't exactly align with where the federal law is. For a state that has so many elections, to have any kind of incongruence between what federal protections are for federal elections versus the state, it can be difficult for voters to navigate, let alone for advocates like myself who are trying to kind of wrap our heads around voting laws and how they apply to voters in whatever form of participation they want to pursue. So, there are a lot of different ways to vote in Louisiana. There's early voting, which is made available to all voters, but often is only provided at one location, the Registrar of Voters Office. That can create a barrier for voters that would need transportation access or who otherwise would have difficulty getting to that physical location. You have voting on election day, which, we'll probably talk a lot about what the accessibility issues are actually at the polls across the state. But then there's also absentee by mail voting. And that is under law, something made available to voters with disabilities, but it can be an arduous and complicated process. It can involve paperwork, doctor's forms, things that can be challenging to acquire and just complicated or confusing to navigate. So I'd say where the law is, there's lots of room for improvement, both at the federal, but certainly at the state level. Then there's just how the law is executed. There are some great accessibility and voting rights laws in this nation. The question is whether or not they're being executed in alignment with how they are written. So, one example is that the ADA applies to all voting sites on election day. Even if a church, for example, that's being used as a polling site doesn't need to be ADA compliant, the other 360 plus days of the year, on election day, it does need to be. But whether or not poll commissioners, workers, folks who are at these sites have checked off every single box to make sure that that's the reality, doesn't always happen. So Janae and I collaborate a lot on training up volunteers to go check on polling sites and see whether or not they are really up to par for all voters, certainly for voters with disabilities. And too often we see that there's not basic things. There isn't signage that's pointing out the most accessible route. Haven't been the parking spots properly designated and marked with the universal symbol of accessibility. Those little things can accumulate and they cause barriers to voting and participating with everyone else on election day. And there are solutions, like it's in the law, there are requirements, but I think more of that execution and understanding of how important those accessibility measures are is where there is certainly room for improvement to address a barrier that we've certainly taken account of.
Absolutely. Thank you for that response, Tori. And I know you mentioned even absentee voting. And whenever I've spoken to other people with disabilities about voting, I know a lot of people who use wheelchairs will almost opt to do mail-in ballots so they don't have to, come across those physical accessibility barriers. But I think it's worth mentioning that even absentee ballots are not universally accessible to all people with disabilities. So for instance, how does a blind voter, vote absentee privately and independently? So I'd love to talk a little bit more about, some new ideas that are happening across the country to fix those barriers later on in our conversation. But first, Janae, I'd like to hear your perspective on this question about the greatest barriers to voting accessibility currently.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Tori definitely hit it right on. But again, when we think about the overall population within the state of Louisiana, I mean, 1/3 of Louisianians have a disability. Adults have a disability, right? And so when she talked about the burdensome form and paperwork and that access, I do want to go into just a little more detail about the documentary proof of disability requirements to even receive federally guaranteed voting assistance and to vote by mail and inaccessible polling sites. So the process within itself is very complicated. To get approved, a voter has to submit a letter from a physician, a copy of a current mobility impaired identification card, a copy of a current documentation showing eligibility for disability benefits. And so again, the steps to enroll in the program and the new registrants voting for the first time must submit a doctor's letter, even certifying that they can appear in person to vote. And then you look at how complex it is to navigate through the program and it requiring additional burdens for individuals. But this, unfortunately, it's going to lead to people sitting out elections, right? There is enough barriers in state with those that have disabilities currently. And so not having their voices and needs represented in policies is another barrier that would have to go through because it's so much complications for them to gain different access. And like you said, of course, voting by mail can be offered, but what does happen with those who have visual impairments? And when we look at specific examples within Louisiana, particularly back in 2015, a disability rights group in Jefferson Parish, they shared that numerous polling locations were not ADA compliant. And this goes back to our election protection program that Tori and I have managed for 3 or 4 years at this time now. But instead of bringing the locations up to code or moving them, Jefferson Parish just had fewer polling locations. So that was 25 fewer polling places going into the 2018 election. So it's important to note that this isn't a solution by creating additional barriers, because now there's not as much as mentioned before, there's inaccessibility to transportation and transportation barriers. Now folks have less of an opportunity to be able to cast their ballots or even have assistance, right? Because there has even been documented cases of disabled voters not being allowed voting assistance of their choice, with poll workers not being up to speed as or educated into different rights as it's connected to those with disabilities. So these are all barriers that unfortunately is a reality, again, for 1/3 of Louisiana's adult population. But I will say that I'm excited to share some of the things that Louisiana has been working on to help alleviate some of these barriers.
Thank you, Janae, for that response. And I really like how you touched upon the documentation piece, because I think that's a piece that a lot of people underestimate how complicated it can be and how burdensome it can be for people with disabilities, simply because we know people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty and have less access to healthcare and those diagnoses they need for that documentation and that access to doctor's visits that they need for documentation. And even just individuals with really rare conditions who don't get diagnosed for over 10 years, are missing out on that access. And oddly enough, elections can actually be, higher stakes for people with disabilities simply because our elected officials make decisions on healthcare and home and community-based services. And so the people whose, voices arguably are, most impacted have the least access to our democracy. So Ashley, I want to open up this question to you and get your perspective as well.
Yes, so all the other panelists gave some great details that I was going to mention, especially with the documentation, the access to transportation, and just the signage and different things at the polling place. I just want to address the comments about access for the blind community. I don't know if this gets implemented the way it should, but for absentee ballots, people in the blind community can be emailed an absentee ballot link that can be read by a screen reader. Like I said, I don't know how well it gets implemented or if people of the blind community have problems with it, but we should have that program in the state of Louisiana. But at DRLA, at Disability Rights Louisiana, we do survey polling places on election day. We didn't do it during the pandemic, during COVID, but before then we found that the greatest barriers, and during our hotline, we found that the greatest barrier was transportation to the polls, especially in the New Orleans area. And then during the pandemic, people were sending in complaints that they weren't receiving their mail-in ballots, or they would mail them in, but the office of the registrar wouldn't get them in time for their vote to be counted. So we have to acknowledge that and do changes to that. And I also read several reports that the extent of technology available for accommodations for people with disabilities were not up to par or working correctly. And also we have a big problem of poll workers not being educated on the accessibility or accommodations available to people with disabilities. So that makes it 10 times harder for people with disabilities to vote. And a lot of times people with disabilities do not know what accommodations are available to them, because as a person with a disability, you don't get a letter stating that if you have this or that disability, this is what you can ask for. Before I started doing this work myself, I didn't even realize that if you have a disability that can be seen, you can go to the front of the line on election day. So there's a lot of communication that needs to be put out to the public. Also, as people have mentioned already, at several of these locations, voting locations, there aren't parking lots for people to park or to get dropped off safely. One other thing is we don't have access to curbside voting for those that can't get out of their cars to go in and vote. So there needs to be a lot of education, and I'm glad that the documentation piece was brought up, because we heard complaints of people having trouble with being able to validate their ballot. And what I mean by this is, when you get an absentee ballot, you need someone to sign saying that you voted as a competent major. But during the pandemic, especially, there was issues with having people come in and out of your home, even because, you didn't want to have that exposure. So even though some of these things might seem small, they began to be big for people that are voting. For me, in particular, at my voting spot, the accessible door was closed, and I couldn't climb the steps. And luckily, I had someone with me at the time, but I could see that being an instance where the person with the disability turns around because they feel like they don't have a number or anything to call, because there wasn't signage telling me to call this number to open the door. And I told my polling place, and the next time they had the door propped open. So that was good that they changed that. But it's just those little things that people may or may not think about that affects people with disabilities access and right to the vote.
I think you touched on a lot of great points, but specifically the part about education, how you don't necessarily get that letter in the mail, telling you what accommodations you have. And that even applies to any disability, disability access thing that you have, right? Accessing medical care or services through the state. I mean, you don't get a letter on how to be disabled, which is a deeply unfortunate thing. But you mentioned how blind voters have access to that accessible PDF ballot that can be emailed to them. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that was implemented through Act 508 of 2016, I believe. Yeah, but I think what's so difficult about this is that it's gave us a step forward in accessibility, but at the same time, the voter still has to print out their completed ballot and mail it to the registrar's office or drop it off at a polling location. So it's accessible on the front end, but inaccessible on the tail end, which is kind of silly to me. And you mentioned even accessing absentee ballots, and we had that bill this session, House Bill 352 by Landry, where you'd have prepaid postage for absentee ballots, and that failed. So we have all these barriers to absentee voting for people with disabilities, where we take one step forward and two steps back. And I'm so glad that you brought all these issues up, because they're so important. So we do have one question actually a couple questions from Jim Mitchell, but this is a really interesting one. What is more important? Poll workers who know my rights, or trained poll workers who know the rights of people with disabilities, or the voter knowing their rights? So Ashley, do you want to take a stab at this question first?
That is a difficult question, but I'll try. I think in this case, I would say it would be the poll worker being trained about the right, because even if you don't know your rights as a person with a disability, that trained poll worker should be able to see that you have a disability right on when you go up to the table or the desk where they're at. So they should be able to ask you if you need an accommodation. Now, they can't go into the particulars, but if they're trained, they should be able to make everyone aware. Or maybe if there was signage even in the polling place that said, if you need any sort of accommodation, ask the poll worker. Just something as simple as that, right? That would make people aware. So I think we do need the education for people with disabilities, which I need to do more of, and I want to do more of. But we need to really train the poll workers to be comfortable with those accommodations and to be comfortable with people with disabilities.
I think that comfortable, I can't say the word, but that comfort with people with disabilities is huge. because whenever you're not comfortable with interacting with all types of voters, so many barriers pop up. And your point about having the poll workers trained first and foremost is so important, simply because I feel like the burden of education falls on people with disabilities so frequently. You know, you have to educate yourself on your rights for every service that you have to access, for any, you know, medical device you have to purchase. And so that you're constantly having to educate yourself on your own rights. And so I think it'd be really nice if voting was just a little bit more simple for people with disabilities and you could go and vote just like anyone else. So Janae, Tori, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Well, I mean, I can definitely say that education and like intellectual property is definitely needed when you think about advocacy and empowering, disseminating different information to vulnerable populations, right? As a poll worker, it's your job, right? And so as a job, it's up to you to be an expert within that field. And I think it's critical for folks to be educated on the importance of disability rights, the inequities, even as a poll worker, how you can create certain systems or at least advocate to better a particular system because it is your job and because it is your passion and you're connected to this. And I'll also say, I mean, it's even more critical because we have documented proof where folks with disabilities have gone to different polling locations and have been denied access to the polling booths, have been denied access for help, have been denied access for certain things that they are required by law to have access to. As Tori shared light on it before, you know, there is sometimes a gray area as it relates to state law in comparison to federal law and what's mandated and required for those who have accessibility barriers. So I will definitely agree with Ashley that this does fall on the poll worker to ensure that they're educated. But I do think that as advocates in this space and in this work, such as those that are connected to the Power Coalition, the NAACP, LDF, and others, it's up to us to ensure that folks are all around educated and aware of certain inequities and moving things forward and being forward thinking and to creating solutions to so many of the problems that we have within our state connected to accessibility barriers.
Thank you, Janae. Tori?
Well, I would echo so much of what has been said already. And I think certainly the general consensus that there's a responsibility of election officials to not only understand the law, but enforce it in a way that is appropriate and does not further burden voters who are just trying to exercise their constitutional rights. I think we all agree, and certainly in our voter education work, in the materials that we distribute and directly mail to voters with nonpartisan know your voting rights materials, we are always trying to list some of those basic provisions and protections for voters with disabilities to get the assistance that they want to freely and fairly vote. But, you know, as much as knowledge is power for the voter, it really comes down to election officials, because there is a power dynamic in that setting where if election officials are hearing you say, but I have a right to, this is the law, I know my rights. If they are not truly acknowledging that and informed of that and enforcing those rights as they're written, that's when people turn away. Just as Janae was saying, we've seen this in instances, you know, with confusion around voter identification requirements and people saying, oh, you need an ID or you can't vote. Not true in Louisiana. You can sign an affidavit. Similarly, with certain accessibility provisions, like if election workers, poll commissioners, folks in charge at these sites don't know the law, they can very much misapply it or intimidate voters with disabilities who are not going to sit there and fight that whole time. And hopefully, I mean, we try to lift up the resources, not only of some of the local hotlines, but also the national 866 Our Vote hotline, which is staffed completely by civil rights volunteers, is completely nonpartisan, and is entirely based around this idea of making sure that voters are equipped with information about their rights, but also reporting issues. I think the difficulty with that is, one, making sure folks know that that's a resource, and also understanding that it so often is those voters who know their rights who are calling into lines like that saying, you know, my rights were violated, here's a problem. When voters don't know their rights, they will take it as a given what an election official is saying, and that is intimidating, that's deterring, and that's why so many voters with disabilities especially are not included with our democracy in ways that are horrific. I saw one recent statistic from experts out of Rutgers University recently, but I think it was 1.75 million more voters would be added to our democracy if you had equitable voting patterns across the disabilities community and voters within the rest of the population. That's absurd. Like, those are eligible voters who are just being turned away from full participation in our democracy, and none of us should be okay with that. So I think there's so much burden really that should be taken off of voters with disabilities, who too often have to do all this work, have to educate the rest of us, fight for their own individual rights, let alone collective rights. And that onus should really be on our leadership and folks with power, even at that most granular level of being a poll worker on election day. That's a powerful post, and people should be using it to make sure that every voter is able to cast their ballot equally and accessibly.
Absolutely. And I think you make a great point about how so much of the onus is on people with disabilities to, declare their rights at the polling place. And I think in the current cultural context that we're functioning in right now, it can be more important for the voters to know their rights, because it is pretty likely that the poll workers won't know because of that lack of training. And so in an ideal world, obviously our poll workers would be aware of accessibility needs and individuals' rights. But in the absence of that, we do have those voters who are informed, who are calling into those lines. And I think it's really interesting because I sat on the Voting Systems Commission over the past year, and we heard a lot of public testimony, and there was a large idea that, people with disabilities were a very small population, that we could make special accommodations for them, but overall they're a very small minority, even though people with disabilities are one of the largest minority groups there is. And so this could lead us into our next question of, how are the barriers that people with disabilities face while voting overlap with barriers faced by other minority communities or underserved communities? Janae, do you want to take a stab at this question first?
Yeah, definitely. So, we mentioned earlier that there's an equity to access as relates to education, transportation, healthcare. All of these things are intersectional within vulnerable populations or minority populations, right? And again, as Tori stated before, it's the elected officials and policymakers' duty to consider equity access to many of these barriers. When you think about access to computers and laptops, we mentioned before that some folks with disabilities, they can complete their ballots. Their ballots can be emailed and it has to be printed out. But when we look at this, as it relates to access to computers and phones, electronic devices, only 77% of American adults have even access to laptops or desktops, right? When you think about specifically within the state of Louisiana, many of those folks who are in rural communities do not have access to the internet. I always try to advocate around this issue as it relates to education and other factors, because I'm currently in New Orleans, but I'm from a small rural community, Napoleonville, Louisiana, where there is a lack of access in education and infrastructure, healthcare, internet, accessibility, and all of those things. So saying that to say, looking at nationwide, why just 53% report owning a tablet device. So we're looking at low-income voters, and voters of color are especially unlikely to have access to any of these tools. And of Americans, when we're looking at income, household income, so of Americans making less than $30,000 annually, only about 76% of people owning smartphones, compared with 96% of those making at least $75,000 have access to this as well. So we can assume that, those in charge can assume that every disabled voter even has assistive care, right? Or trusted aid who can even help them complete voting related tasks. So it's critical, and it's very important that election systems create accessible voting solutions, and emerging voting technology must be designed in ways to ensure that all voters with disabilities have full and equal access to the ballot box and can cast a vote securely, right? An independent ballot, regardless of whether they have personal electronic devices or if they can even afford help.
Absolutely. And I love how you bring up maybe not having access to a person who can assist you in a trustworthy way, right? Because in the absence of accessibility that allows a person with a disability to cast their vote privately and independently, you need that assistance. But what's more private than your vote? Who do you trust to cast your vote if perhaps you can't see what they're doing? Especially with people in smaller communities who may have smaller circles. What do you do then? Ashley, what are your thoughts on this question?
So thank you, Janae, for bringing up all those statistics and all that wonderful insight. And I just want to address the access to a person you trust, right? When you need substantial amounts of care, it's very hard because maybe you're in a relationship with that person where you feel like you can't go against their vote, or something might happen to you, or they might not cast it right. No one can tell what goes on behind the booth, so you also have to think about the person's safety and whether they're comfortable with making a decision that might not be what the other person wants to make. So being able to do your vote independently is the best way, even though in my trainings I say to get someone you trust. A lot of times you're isolated by that, because that might be the one person that comes in and out of your house every day, and that might be your only socialization. So you have to think about that first and foremost when thinking about having people vote. And also we have to think about people with disabilities not just as a monolithic group. We have to think about people with disabilities intersectionally, right? So Janae brought up a lot of good points about access to care in low income. Although we have a problem in the New Orleans area about transportation to vote, I come from a small rural area, Lafitte, Louisiana, which there's no buses or public transportation out there. So if you don't have a car, you don't have access to those things. And then there's also voter suppression based on race. So if you add that to disability and income levels, then you have a lot of things against you just on that basis. So when we talk about other minority groups, we also have to remember with that question that we're not just a person with a disability, but we also have other social factors that people can see or not see. So there's always a complex level that we have to take into consideration, because we're not just one thing at one particular moment.
I love how you bring up how intersectional disability can be, because we know disability doesn't discriminate against really anything. It doesn't discriminate against race or socioeconomic status or gender identity or anything. And I find it interesting that you bring up this scenario where your caretaker may not agree with what you're voting for, and that may impact your relationship with them, because it echoes a conversation that we had at our LGBT and disability panel yesterday about the inherent interdependence that you experience as a person with a disability that isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing, but it can be a barrier to coming out to people sometimes, because what happens if your caretaker is homophobic or transphobic and you need a different sort of affirmation that you're not receiving, but they're your caretaker, right? So how do you navigate that? And so it's interesting that it's such a similar scenario occurs in voting, but it speaks to that intersectionality of and that interdependence that happens with most people with disabilities. So I'd like to shift the conversation to progress. Our next question is, what type of progress in voting accessibility would you like to see Louisiana make within the next couple of years? And Tori, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Certainly. So we've already heard a few different kind of policy conversations, planting the seeds of different ideas that certainly Janae and I, in collaborating for several years, have been thinking about what would a Louisiana with curbside voting look like? What would reforming the election code to get rid of some of these burdensome documentary requirements for folks to vote absentee by mail, or to provide proof of disability at the polls to be able to fairly access the process and not wait in a 7-hour line or whatever we've observed in recent election cycles. And, and thinking through all these thoughts and being validated in this moment that they've even been part of this conversation, what we've constantly come back to is that, in our collective work, in our election monitoring program, and all the data points from the hundreds and hundreds of polling sites we've gleaned a lot of insight. But what I don't have is the lived experience of being a voter with disabilities in the state of Louisiana. I don't have the expertise to fully bring forward the solutions that would truly bring the state forward on this metric. And so what we came around is this concept of really advocating for an institutionalized space where people with disabilities are guiding that conversation and are pushing policy reforms that come from that lived experience and that expertise, that truly expert insight into what the problems are, but most of all, what the real solutions would be. Not just what, sounds good on paper to a bunch of lawyers or policymakers, but what would actually work and avoid some kind of collateral issues that if you're not living it, you just aren't anticipating in the same way. So what that all led to was pushing for a resolution this year during the regular session, HCR 14, that was about creating a task force that is composed primarily of people with disabilities and other election officials, people with power in the administration of elections in Louisiana. And that was a product of incredible feedback. Lillian, I'm going to lift you up, Bambi, other folks in the space, Disability Rights Louisiana, getting feedback on what even cultivating a task force should look like, who should be appointed, designated in this resolution as membership. And we got the great feedback of saying, not just appointees from a bunch of advocacy groups, but people themselves chosen by these advocacy groups who have disabilities themselves. And so we got this resolution passed. There will be a task force convened with, folks who are participating in this conference right now, either at the table or we hope participating as much possible to craft policies that will be brought forward in the next legislative session. But that's just kind of a step one to get a conversation started, to hopefully have really productive work products coming out of that when it comes to the studies, the conversations, the discourse, and the actual laws. We want bills coming out of this that are going to be viable, that have buy-in, that come from the kind of community and organizing and movement building that a process like this can cultivate. But for me, I want to see this institutionalized. Like, it's not just let's have a task force for 1 year, but we've seen in other states, election commissions or other boards that look at voting rights either at a local or a statewide level, creating subcommittees comprised of voters with disabilities or other experts in the field And what would it look like for Louisiana to have that as a resource, not just for voters with disabilities, but as, part of the institutions, whether it's the state board of election supervisors or other entities, that are constantly needing to grapple with these issues and always make Louisiana the most accessible, the shining light for election administration, especially for voters with disabilities, which truly could be any of us. So I think seeing how we can constantly come back to the experts in this space and have, like Lillian, for example, your voice on the Voting Systems Commission was so important in making sure that there was conversations that were had in crafting decisions for voters across the entire state, let alone for folks watching across the country. Coming back to that idea of always bringing in the experts, always coming back to these experiences and especially the solutions. That's I think where the state can get and has taken some steps towards, but there's a lot more I think that could really be sustained for the long run.
I love your emphasis on having a group of people with disabilities, right? Being the experts on accessible voting, because I think all too often throughout, the entirety of disability history, we've seen where we have a lot of non-disabled people making decisions for disabled people, and it just doesn't work as well. And so I'm really excited about the task force that HGR 14 is going to create, because when you get a group of people with disabilities together, you get such dynamic ideas and such brilliant solutions to everyday problems. And not to mention, people with disabilities are a good time, so it's always bound to be a party. So Ashley, I'd love to hear your take on this question as well.
So thank you, Tori, for bringing up the fact that it needs to be ran by people with disabilities, nothing about us without us. And I want to go back to the fact that we're not a monolithic group. So my experience as a person with cerebral palsy is not going to be Lillian's experience, and she might need something that I have never thought of because that's not in my lived experience or my wheelhouse. So I might not be the most accessible person all the time. So it takes all of us to come together to really create something that works for a majority of us. And so I love this idea, and I love this resolution in this task force. It's going to be great. Also, I was looking before this panel at different states that do excellent work at accessibility or who are trying to modify their accessibility. And in California, what they're doing is they started a tracking system for mail-in ballots, and they do mail-in ballots for every voter. So no matter if you have a disability or not, you're able to vote by mail. So it's not really accessibility for people with disabilities, but accessibility for all. And because of security reasons, they have a system in place that tracks the addresses and the person that it goes out to. And it seems to be working well for them, which I thought was an amazing idea. Now, again, I don't know if that would work for every person with a disability, but I thought that was a creative solution to something that might be seen as a disability problem rather than an accessibility for all. So I think it takes little implementations like that. And also the voices of people with disabilities. And I love Tori's emphasis on the fact that she doesn't just want a task force that lasts for a year, but wants something that we can make true implementations about, because this is the way that we get our voices heard. And one of the things I like to stress in the trainings that I give is that when it comes to politicians or even anyone around you, everyone's not gonna know what your issues are or what matters to you. So you have to make your voice heard, and voting is the primary way that we do it in this country. And there needs to be more advocacy throughout the year to where we introduce ourselves to our legislators and just to make them aware that we are human and have that human connection. Because as we know in Louisiana, we do everything through informal connections, and that's the way we get a lot of things done in this state. And so just building up the advocacy around that. So I think having more advocacy and more power of people with disabilities is going to be one step in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for that answer. We only have about 13 minutes left in our panel. These panels never seem to feel long enough, especially for our conversations on voting accessibility, because I know we could probably go on forever about this, but we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I believe it is time for our rapid fire question session. So we have a question from Jim Mitchell that says, if I am at the poll and believe that my right to a private ballot or my right to choose who assists me are violated, what do I do? So Janae, I'm going to ask this question of you.
So one of the quickest things to do is definitely contact 1-866 Our Vote and notify the election protection hotline, right? Because unfortunately, when you're faced with adversity at the poll, as Tori mentioned, as Ashley mentioned, it can be very intimidating. And it's even more intimidating when you can't thoroughly communicate with someone or you can't express that your rights have been violated. So I would definitely suggest reaching out to 1-866 Our Vote, because then you'll have the opportunity to report this. And we have different legal professionals. You have those that are trained on voting rights and advocacy. You have those that are trained on the law to provide additional assistance. And hopefully, we can troubleshoot to that polling location and try to provide a solution to the issue as well.
Thank you, Janae. Our next question is, do you know of any trainings or education for people with I/DD on voting? Ashley, I'm going to ask this question of you.
Yes, so I can give that training. I do voting accessibility training. So if anyone wants to contact me, I can leave my contact information in the chat.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm gonna mark this question as done. Does any organization put together information on candidate support for people with disabilities? I'm just going to leave this open to anyone because I'm not really sure.
Lillian, this is Bambi. I remember that Disability Rights, which was the Advocacy Center, that back when Governor Edwards was running for the first time, they did a really great interview with our gubernatorial candidates, and there were videoed interviews, and some of the questions that were asked of Governor Edwards, which it was there was 4 candidates and only Governor Edwards and Jay Darden participated. And some of the questions that were asked of the governor when he first came into office, he enacted those things because he made those commitments to the organization, which was, what will he do about employing people with disabilities? And his response was, I will hire people in my office who have disabilities. And he's done that. And so I know that, I don't know if they've done that recently, but I remember in that 2015 election that Disability Rights was involved in that.
Thank you, Bambi.
So thank you, Bambi. That was one of my first projects that I did for the organization. So that was my introduction to the governor. And we have done candidate surveys in the past. We kind of stopped that a little bit during the pandemic, but we might be able to pick that up. I also know there are several organizations that do breakdowns of amendments such as anti-gravity, and I am trying to look for my other recommendations, but I can send that along later because I have a list, but I don't have it on me right now, of course. But I know there are several organizations that you can Google that'll break down the amendments in detail to tell you exactly what they mean for everyone. I also recommend that people go to the actual person's webpage, because a lot of times it'll tell you what their platform is. And also, if you look up their voting records, that's a good way to know what they stand on and what they'll do for you. But Bambi, thank you so much for mentioning that.
It's a great job.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Before we wrap up, I just want to mention two things that everyone should keep their eye out for. That task force that Tori mentioned that was created by HCR 14 that will be comprised of individuals with disabilities making recommendations on, accessibility on voting. And secondly, keep afloat on what the Secretary of State's office is doing, simply because the Voting Systems Commission recently made their recommendations on new voting systems for the state of Louisiana. And so the Secretary of State's office will now be taking those recommendations and starting the RFP process to select our new voting system. So it's just good to stay informed about what's happening in Louisiana as in regards to voting accessibility and voting in general. Ashley, do you mind if I send your email address to the attendees, or would you like it just to keep it with hosts and panelists?
No, of course.
Okay, cool. So we will send that out to everyone. And before we wrap up, does anyone want to make any closing comments?
Oh, go ahead, Ashley.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you so much for this great conversation and for everyone on the panel today.
Thank you, Ashley.
I also wanted to echo a big thank you, not just to everyone for all the incredible work that you're doing and for participating in this panel, but also Lily and Bambi for how this entire conference is being put on. I think we've learned so many lessons in the past few years about how we can bring folks from disparate places into the same space virtually online. And one thing I do hope comes out of candidate forums and legislative hearings and everything else is more opportunities for folks to participate virtually. So we get such incredible information sharing and idea generation. I think that's another way that, just asking for forums like this to be able to talk with people in power, whether it's the governor, your state lawmakers, or other advocates, to just brainstorm and come up with the best ideas to move Louisiana forward and to create fair and accessible elections. I just want to applaud all the work that you've done and pulling together such a wonderful conference as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Tori. It's definitely been a team effort from everyone on the GOTA staff, but everyone has been just phenomenal. Janae, do you have any closing comments?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely going to echo both Tori and Ashley as it relates to one, thanks so much for having this conversation. And I think also that it's important that we think of holistic approaches, right? We think of holistic approaches as we are tackling the different barriers with the accessibility and voting rights and connecting the dots in so many ways of intersectional burdens that are in vulnerable vulnerable populations, right? So when we think about that, when we think about holistic approaches, when we think about, again, centering those that are closest to the problem, definitely being closer to the solutions, we will create change. And I'm big in being focused on building on policy. So I'm very thankful for HCR 14 and it being passed. But again, I do want to see the study and the conversation and things that we can actually place on the table, advocate these ideas into policies and pass into law to make sure that everyone has access to a fair and equitable democratic process. And I look forward to continually working with everyone on this panel and more, because we know that it's power in numbers.
Absolutely. It's been phenomenal working with you all. And I just wanted to give a big thank you for participating in this panel and having this really important conversation. Thank you to all of the attendees for watching and listening and for all the amazing questions. And huge thank you for the GOTA staff for, for everyone just working together and putting this very large conference on. All right. Thank y'all. Goodbye, everyone.